Hello and welcome to the first mini-episode of A Brief History of Everything Season 3. The aim of this episode is to set the scene for the larger episodes that Chris and I will talk about. I'm your solo host for this episode, Thomas, and I'm going to talk about World War I in a very general sense, try and get us through 1917, 1918 and 1919 to set the stage for America's larger involvement and the impacts it will have on the resultant years that, again, Chris and I will discuss. So without any further ado, I give you the first mini-episode for A Brief History of Everything. In Europe, when the Great War began in August of 1914, most of the civilian populations were pleased. Here was the chance for men to be heroes, to dress up in smart uniforms that would attract the ladies, to go to a foreign country and teach them a lesson. Even the generals expected a short war with few casualties. Home by Christmas was what everyone said and thought. The last war in Europe, remember, had been fought in 1871. It had been a war of swords and horses, glittering colours and cavalry charges. Since then, the only sizable wars had been far away in Africa and the Far East. In these, the Europeans had learned that it was unwise to wear their brightly coloured uniforms and that the machine gun was a vital weapon, but on the whole the battles had been of the same sort. So in 1914 this was the kind of war they expected again. There was also a feeling that the time had come for a showdown, at least in Europe. Since 1900 there had been several international disputes and crises. Most of these had been between the great powers of France, Britain, Germany and Russia. They had solved their disputes without wars, but in all of them there was a feeling that, in the end, only a real great war would show which countries were truly the most powerful. So when war was declared, across Europe, there were many people who were pleased and excited, not worried and frightened at all. On the other hand, in 1914, 2 years after his election, Woodrow Wilson and most of the American people were hoping to keep out of the First World War. They regarded it as a European quarrel and, as such, no business of theirs. It soon became obvious, however, that America would have to become involved. The factories and farms of the United States could produce the food and war goods which Britain and France desperately needed, and so trade between the Americans and the Allies increased. This meant that American ships carrying American citizens were frequently crossing the Atlantic to Britain, and this is where the trouble began between the United States and Germany. It's this access to resources and the involvement of American ships in facilitating this access to specifically Britain and France, which is going to become a very significant factor in the escalation of tensions and then the declaration of war from Germany against the United States. Britain's command of the seas at the start and then throughout World War I meant that the Allies could draw on the resources of the whole world. The Dominions, that being the British and French Empire, contributed their share to the British war effort, and even before the USA declared war on Germany, the Allies had been able to purchase supplies from the United States. The failure in the initial years of World War I of the first German offensives and the stalemate that evolved in the West gave time for long-term factors to become important, as opposed to this being a short-term war. In the long run, the worldwide resources which the Allies could command inevitably outweighed those of Germany and Austria. The Allies succeeded in winning the sympathy of the neutrals, including, most important, that of the USA. Here, propaganda played its part. The English were immeasurably superior to the Germans in putting across their case through the American media. In doing so, they spurned none of the arts of the propagandists. They lied and they grossly exaggerated alleged German atrocities. But the Germans always gave them something to decry. Their initial invasion of Belgium was morally inexcusable. Their rule was inevitably oppressive. The Germans were the first of the belligerents to use gas. Their sinking of passenger vessels by submarine was another breach of international law. whatever its excuse in terms of total war, which profoundly shocked people in the USA. Focusing in on the United States population for just a minute, it's important to remember that the United States, prior to the outbreak of World War I, had very close ties of blood and culture with Great Britain. They were the two great English-speaking peoples of the world, and a large percentage of Americans were direct descendants of former British emigrants. Many Americans could trace their ancestry to other European countries, France, Italy, as well as most others, and of course there were about 6 million Americans of German descent in 1914. So at the start of the war, Americans tended to favour the Allies, although not all Americans could be said to do so. Yet they were very much against taking part in a war which they saw as a squabble between a number of small countries over petty jealousies, as we started with. They saw no reason why American sons and husbands should die in a senseless war, which was none of their making. Americans felt that Europe should be left to settle its own differences. And so, from the beginning, Woodrow Wilson, the American president, declared his country's intention of remaining neutral. Following the invasion of Belgium in 1914, as I said, newspapers began to carry accounts of dreadful German atrocities. Belgian women were said to have been molested and their children maimed. Pictures of children without arms stirred American public opinion. The stories were very much exaggerated and often totally untrue, but nevertheless the image of the beastly Hun was started and took root. In May 1915, a German U-boat sank the British liner Lusitania without warning, and there were 128 Americans amongst those drowned. In the United States, there was a widespread demand for a declaration of war. The German authorities pointed out that the ship was carrying war materials and that a warning had been given in the American press. To restore calm, the Kaiser, who was the leader of Germany at this time, promised that such torpedoings would not happen again. Later, in October, a British nurse called Edith Cavell was shot by a German firing squad. As matron of a hospital in Brussels, which was in Belgium, she had helped wounded Allied soldiers to escape. The Americans joined in the appeal for her life, but to no avail. These events helped to confirm the propaganda campaigns of the British that the stories of German brutality were true. The British press continued to use these specific events in their propaganda campaigns, creating a kind of memory throughout the American public that they could call back to all the way through to 1917. Now, of course, the Kaiser was in a very difficult situation. In 1915, especially 1916, if he allowed German submarines to sink neutral shipping, he ran the risk of war with the United States. If he did not, the Allies were free to receive a pretty well unrestricted flow of war materials from across the Atlantic. It was lose-lose for the Kaiser. To American industry, the war was a rewarding business. Between 1914 and 1916, trade with the Allies increased fourfold. In theory, the Germans were also free to trade with the United States, but the British Royal Navy made that impossible with their blockade of the North Sea. For 2.5 years, the Kaiser stood firm against the demand of his generals and admirals for unrestricted submarine warfare. But as the situation on the Western Front worsened and the blockade imposed by the British caused severe food and resource shortages on the German home front, Wilhelm grew less concerned about American feelings and more concerned with winning the war. From a commercial point of view, the United States had taken sides in the war a long time ago, and it was this firming up of ideas in Kaiser Wilhelm's mind that led him down the path that is going to drag the United States into the war. Finally, in January 1917, he yielded to pressure and gave way. He agreed to the free and ruthless use of U-boats against ships of any nationality in the waters around the British Isles and Western France. It was a big, big gamble. The Germans hoped to bring the Allies to their knees in 6 months, but there was always the risk that if neutral ships were sunk and American lives lost, the United States would thus enter the war. Meanwhile, in the United States, Woodrow Wilson had been re-elected in 1916 president under the slogan of "He kept us out of the war." Once safely back in the White House, he made every effort to bring about peace. He offered to mediate between the Allies and the Central Powers in order to bring about, as he called it, peace without victory. His efforts were in vain and ignored for the most part by those European powers. 4 days after the Kaiser's decision to continue with unrestricted submarine warfare, the United States broke off diplomatic relations with Germany. Still, many Americans clung to the hope of peace, but as more of their ships were sunk, the chances appeared slim. Late in February 1917, yet another British liner was sunk, the Laconia, and 3 more Americans were drowned in the Atlantic. A week later, news of the Zimmermann telegram appeared in the newspapers. Arthur Zimmermann, the German foreign minister, had sent a coded message to the German envoy or ambassador in Mexico. The message suggested a possible alliance between Mexico and Germany, and in the event of America entering World War I, support for an invasion of the United States by the Mexican army to reclaim the states of New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. Thus, Germany hoped to keep American troops from entering the European theatre by opening up another front on America's southern border. The telegram was intercepted and decoded by the British, who then made its contents known to the Americans. The German ambassador, Johann von Bernstorff, claimed the telegram to be a fake in one of the early editions of Fake News. Unfortunately, at that time, the diplomat was a laughingstock and not taken seriously at all. With anti-German feeling already running high, the disclosure of the Zimmermann telegram was the last straw. On the 2nd of April 1917, Wilson appeared before a specially called meeting of the Congress of the United States. America, he said, is privileged to spend her blood and might for the principles that gave her birth. His audience burst into wild and deafening applause, and on 6 April, the United States declared war on Germany. The Allies greeted the news with great relief. Soon, the great reserves of materials and manpower of America would be available on the Western Front, and this would surely swing the war in their favour. However, the Americans first had to mobilise and prepare, and this would take some months. The Germans were now in a race to break the stalemate on the Western Front before America's might and weight could be felt to its fullest. If Germany were going to win the war, they had to defeat the Allies before America arrived. Germany did have their chance. They could now, in fact, concentrate all their military might onto the Western Front, given that at the same time as America was entering World War I, Russia was in the process of leaving World War I and thus ending the fight on the Eastern Front. The problems that had faced Russia in 1917 were not all to do with the war, but to understand them, it's best to reach back into history. The people had tired of the rule of Nicholas and hated his German-born wife Alexandra, Nicholas being the Tsar of Russia. Since 1905, the royal couple had allowed themselves to be influenced by a scoundrel mystic, Grigory Rasputin. On the home front, the Russian people had endured great hardship, whilst the badly equipped and unprepared soldiers on the Eastern Front still struggled to halt the Germans. By January 1917, the Russians had suffered enough. Soldiers were deserting, tensions were growing, riots and strikes were breaking out all across Russia, and in some towns, workers set up their own councils and local governments called Soviets. During March, the Tsar was overthrown and a provisional government set up. In April of 1917, the great revolutionary leader Lenin returned from exile, largely aided by Germans. He came to Russia promising the people peace, bread and land, and won over popular support. By early November of 1917, Lenin and his Bolshevik supporters had seized power and soon afterwards sought peace with Germany. With the war in the East over, that meant that the Germans could now concentrate their efforts against the Allies, try to break the Western Front before the United States was fully engaged, and ultimately win World War I. And with that, we bring this first mini-episode to a close. Hopefully you've been able to understand and gain some insight into America's involvement in World War One and the reasons why the resultant historical trends and influences that we will discuss in later episodes really were born out of these early actions, President Woodrow Wilson's choices to go into World War One and America's larger role in that great conflict. I look forward to joining you all again in the next mini episode where we will pick up where we left off and go a little bit closer to America's domestic situation as we discuss this in later episodes. So thank you, goodbye, and we'll see you soon.